I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 181st episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to improve your brain and, in this case, the brains of your entire society, potentially. Let me give you a little tease of what we're about to be talking about. This is a cognitive intervention that you have almost certainly done yourself, and very likely everyone you know has done in one form or another, and has major ramifications on the way that our brains are organized, that we start with at a very young age and goes through some of our most important developmental stages of life. And if those weren't enough clues, this particular cognitive intervention is state mandated. We are talking about education, something which we probably have not spent enough time in the past talking about on this show, but given its relevance to the brain, not paying attention to it, we do so at our peril. Education is certainly one of those things that's given time to get its reps in. We spend years of our life in the educational system, and it's probably fair to ask, since its overt goal is to really have our brains pop out the other end behaving in certain ways, is it doing its job? And is the job that it's doing a job that it should be doing to begin with? Given the big changes in the way that society operates and what people are expected to do from one decade to the next or one generation to the next, is our educational system in need of a big overhaul? That is the question being posed by our guest today, Dr. Zak Stein. We'll be talking about the future of education, how we might best design that future given what we know about the way that brains operate, a far-reaching discussion that goes into both neuroscience and social policy. That will be in the main interview. Also, upfront acknowledgement, you can probably hear it in my voice. I'm getting over a cold the last couple days, so there will not be any a cappella performances in this podcast by me or anyone else. Luckily, the interview itself was recorded weeks ago, back when I was my healthy self, but hopefully the before and after bits with me sounding a bit froggy won't be too annoying. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to give you a Stanford researcher's study trick. This is a hack that allegedly takes only 15 minutes, but can lift B+ students into the A range, so a well-invested 15 minutes if it scores you an A at Stanford. That'll be in the ruthless listener retention gimmick, but for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So when you think about endangered species, you're probably thinking about things like the giant pandas that won't breed in captivity or an exotic species of frogs, things like that. You're not thinking about humans, and of course humans are not endangered, but there is a small subfraction of the human population that are not getting any greater in number, and very likely never will be. That is, people who have undergone a corpus callosotomy, better known as split brain patients. This is a procedure that isn't really done anymore. Medical science has moved on, but it was something that was done for a while for people who were dealing with incurable epilepsy, surgically severing or removing the corpus callosum, the major bundle of nerve fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. Severing those connections was effective in keeping epileptic seizures from propagating across the brain, but this isn't something that's been done much in the last few decades. The split brain patients that are still with us are getting older, and soon we're going to be kind of looking at the last of the Mohicans when it comes to split brain people, which is interesting and important because one of the byproducts of having that procedure done on a number of people was some really interesting tests to how the brain operates, what the left and the right hemispheres are doing semi-independently of one another, tests you just can't do in somebody with an off-the-shelf, unsevered brain. And for many decades, the conventional wisdom and what's still in the medical textbooks that are out there now had some really shocking, really peculiar findings. We've talked about them on past episodes of this show. Ideas that are pretty widely disseminated in the public consciousness based on the work of Roger Sperry. This was a scientist who won a Nobel Prize for his work. The original reports from 50 years ago now, back in the 60s, suggested that if you took a split brain patient and restricted their visual inputs so you could show them objects just with their right eye or just with their left eye, they would be unable to verbally describe anything that appeared on the left side of the space, nor could their right hand point to it or point to a picture matching it or draw a picture, even though the right hemisphere of their brain knew what was there. The right brain could use the left hand to point to the target or to draw a picture that matched it. The implication being that it was as if these patients had two separate minds, with one of the minds knowing what was on one side of the space, even if the other half was totally ignorant of it. It wasn't just that the physical organ of the brain had been snipped in half at this connection point. It was like consciousness itself had undergone mitosis and you wound up with two independent minds, which of course befuddled everybody and does to this day. It's really weird to think, what exactly does that mean for those of us with unbisected corpus callosums? But researcher Jer Pinto at the University of Amsterdam has been turning back the clock, looking at these original findings and trying to find out, is this something that should be taken at face value? Has the conventional wisdom for the last 50 years been correct? Because there aren't all that many split brain procedure patients left to double check this against. And apparently it's a good thing he checked, because it seems that the answer is no. In his recent research published in the journal Brain, it appears that the minds of these people remains unified despite having the corpus callosum severed. There's certainly some difficulties in communication that arise, but the mind itself remains one piece. Pinto and his colleagues conducted 5 experiments with 2 split brain patients, with each experiment basically being variations on a theme that was either verbally or by pointing. The patient had to assess the position or identify pictures, shapes, things that appeared on one side or another of a computer screen, and then identify or compare those shapes to things on the other side of the screen. And what he found was that information processed by one side or the other did at some point become available to awareness, to the mind, at a unified overall level, which the participants could report on verbally or act on with either arm, so left or right side of the brain controlling. Now, one potential confounding factor is that obviously the split brain procedure itself happened many decades in the past now, and it's possible that the original split minds phenomenon was real, but was something transient, and that brain plasticity in the intervening years has kind of fixed the problem. That's one we'll probably never know. That's probably a mystery for the ages. But, says Pinto, we have shown that severing the cortical connections between the 2 brain hemispheres does not seem to lead to 2 independent conscious agents within one brain. This raises the intriguing possibility that even without massive communication between the cerebral hemispheres, and thus increases in modularity, unity in consciousness and responding is largely preserved. So one of those weirdest of all brain facts, pieces of brain trivia, being semi-debunked, getting slightly less weird. It reminds me a little of a physicist coming out now and saying, hey, you know all that quantum mechanics we've been talking about? Yeah, it turns out that's not exactly right. But that is one of the great things about science, the way it's supposed to work. Nothing is ever static. No fact can rest on its laurels, nor would we want it to.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Squidgems from the USA says, I have survived 4 heart attacks 7 years ago, and I need all the information that this podcast has. The mushroom info, the brain hack info, everything. And Living Room Mac, also from the USA, says, when I was introduced to this podcast, I thought it was just going to be a commercial for psychedelics. Instead, I have learned so much. The podcast may have a slight slant, but it does a great job of presenting some truly alternative solutions to anxiety and depression. Thank you. Well, thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone that's been leaving iTunes reviews and spreading the word on Smart Drug Smarts in other ways. I know some other podcasters. Podcasters are probably a tight little community knitting circle kind of thing. And of course, naturally, we compare notes on how we spread the word on our podcast, how we get more people to find out about it. And I get the sense that Smart Drug Smarts listeners do a better job of just gabbing about Smart Drug Smarts than some other podcast listeners do about their respective podcasts. So group hug to all of you out there. Very much appreciated. Longtime listeners will know that for the last couple of years, each year I've done a 1-week water fast inspired by the work and research of Dr. Thomas Seyfried. I won't go into the full details now, but anyway, early warning that probably sometime in the month of July, maybe August, probably July, but looking ahead to doing a water fast sometime in the relatively near future. If you are interested in participating, we'll get together an online group of Smart Drug Smarts listeners to commiserate with one another during that week. Definitely makes things a bit easier. Also gives you people to ask questions to as questions come up. If you want to get on the mailing list for that, just drop me an email, jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. I'll also be talking about that more in an upcoming newsletter piece on the Brain Breakfast newsletter. If you are not yet signed up for the Brain Breakfast, that is smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter to get me your email. Given that I am getting over a cold, decency forbids me from saying anything about supplement companies. You shouldn't trust an obese cardiologist, and you shouldn't take any supplement advice from a guy with the sniffles. But hopefully I will be reputable again by next week.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So I'm about to be speaking with Dr. Zak Stein, who comes from a background of educational neuroscience, human development, and the philosophy of education at Harvard University. He currently teaches at Meridian University, and he's also on the scientific advisor board of the Neurohacker Collective. We spoke with Daniel Schmachtenberger, the founder of the Neurohacker Collective, probably a half dozen, maybe more episodes ago, talking about the future of medicine. Now we're talking about the future of education, so a lot of future thinking going on over at the Neurohacker Collective. Probably never a bad thing to prepare for the future. We all know it's coming. We just don't know quite what it'll look like. The first 3 words about himself on Dr. Zak Stein's website describe him as a high-achieving dyslexic. And as you'll hear in the coming interview, his dyslexia has actually really informed his whole view of the educational system, how it operates now, how it could be doing better, and how it might be changed to achieve better outcomes in the future. I feel like it's really easy to forget when we think about education that really education is a giant conveyor belt for brains. The outcomes that we do want from our educational system are essentially changes to the way that people think and are likely to behave. So looking back at our educational system in view of the recent findings that we've had, certainly in the time since our education system has kind of stabilized, we know so much more about the way that brains operate and what they best respond to now. How could we retool education to work better for all involved? That's the discussion we're about to have, so don't fall asleep in class, settle in your desks, and get ready for this guest lecture by Dr. Zak Stein.
Everything we know about the adolescent brain in particular would suggest that the school day ought to start much later in the morning, if not after lunch. That's a simple example of the way that schools can actually work against the optimal development of the brain. There's also the fact that for a very long time in human history, in fact, the vast majority of human history, human brains did not read, which is to say we did not neuronally recycle our face recognition system to become a grapheme recognition system and become literate. And yet now we are doing in schools on an everyday basis forms of mathematics that were extremely rare in ancient times. So the Pythagorean theorem, for example, was a frickin' mystical insight. Like it was an insight into the reality of the cosmos for a limited number of elite people. And now every 8th grader is learning the Pythagorean theorem. And so literacy and numeracy affect the developing brain. This is very clear. So what we can say from just this brief conversation is that through the large-scale institutionalization of schooling, we've had a massive impact on the development of the brain because so many people now are literate, numerate, right?
What do we actually see in brain differences between literate and illiterate people? Is it parts of the speech areas that do double duty when we're reading and writing? I mean, obviously the visual cortex is going to be involved, but what portions of the brain handle our reading requirements?
There's a few things to say. One is that brains are very unique. There are many ways to become a reader. So for example, with my dyslexia, I became a reader in a different way than perhaps you did if you're not dyslexic. There are some generalities. So I'm going to hone in on one specific thing, which I already mentioned, which is this hypothesis of neuronal recycling. And so this comes from the work of Stanislas Dehaene, and he's a French neuroscientist who looks specifically at mathematics and other things. But when he was looking at the way we process graphemes, right, which is to say this unique thing in our visual field, which is a kind of squiggle that has meaning, he showed pretty interestingly in Scanner and with a few other methods that what gets recruited by the brain to do that, to recognize a grapheme as a semiotic object in the visual field, what gets recruited is what gets recruited before you read to recognize faces, and specifically emotional complexity. And so that's interesting. And there's overlaps. And of course, when you look at fMRI studies, it's always averages of averages. But the point being that brains did not evolve to read. I always like to say this, like as a dyslexic, that disability emerges at the interface of biology and specific cultural expectations. There's no dyslexia in illiterate or non-literate societies, period. Dyslexia doesn't exist in the same way when you're using a pictographic alphabet as opposed to our alphabet.
Yeah, you can't be a bad typist in the era before typewriters.
Exactly, right? And so it's interesting that we essentialize or kind of reify many of these disabilities as if there's some genetic code for dyslexia. Well, there can't really be. What there is a code for certain forms of neurodiversity which interface with cultural expectations and forms of text, etc. So that's kind of one way to think about it, is that the brain didn't evolve to read, but what schooling has done is on a large scale get everyone to use their brains in this unique way, to neuronally recycle some part that was used for something else for this radically cultural and kind of novel activity of reading. Different than speech. Speaking comes naturally. Reading seems to be kind of bolted on and using other things, and so do other forms of high-level thought and symbol operation. Schooling has a massive effect on the brain and has been for centuries, for good and for ill. And this is where it gets interesting, because school has also made certain forms of neuronal development, let's say, as a proxy for psychological development, skill development. Certain of those are more valuable than others. Certain of those are paid attention to more than others. Certain of those get financial reward as opposed to others. And so there's a homogenizing effect to mass schooling. Another narrative here is that, yes, everyone's learning to read and write. And so we're getting this new kind of brain that's evolving on a large scale. But we're also getting a kind of regimentation, potential homogenization, restrictive functioning on what could be the potentials of the brain. So for example, meditative meditative states, which I do a lot of work with. Massive potential in every human brain to be capable of deep meditative states. That's not in school. And so this is one of those things where it's about not just the brain, it's about the way the brain is in culture and the way the potentials that are implicit in the brain are expressed or not expressed given the context, and especially given socio-cultural context with all of these ethical and normative kind of emotionally laden expectations, which is what schooling is, which is what the family is. So schooling and the brain are huge. The simplest thing for me is the time of day it starts. I say this at schools all the time because you get the cheer from the students like, yeah, like it's way too early to take the adolescent brain, get it up at like 6 a.m. and showered and out the door. It's like, whoa, what are you doing? It's like torture.
There seem to be a lot of things where, from what we've learned in the past couple of decades of research, we're sort of swimming upstream with our educational system, having kids which are wired to move and using their bodies physically, sitting still in desks, and you get in trouble if you're moving.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And that's another case where good neuroscience, even good psychology, will just say this is crazy. You know, you can't have a kid of this age, you can't reasonably expect them to sit there for 4 hours straight. One of the powers of neuroscience and of the human sciences in general is what philosophers call explanatory critique, which is to say, once you know there's a certain process at work, you have no good reason to behave otherwise. If you're behaving otherwise, it means there's some ulterior factor. And so for the school day, it has to do with the way the schools have been, for lack of a better phrase, a holding pen for the youth while mom and dad go to work. The biggest problem with changing the starting time of the school day is that mom and dad go to work at 9. And if the kids don't go to work until 11, there's 2 hours. So what do? You hire someone to take care of them, or what happens? And so it's interesting. And my latest book, I'm talking about how all of these macroeconomic reforms are actually necessary to make schools the way they need to be for optimal brain development.
So I'm going to just rip the lid off the ethical can of worms here and say, what are some of the frameworks by which we might try to devise what optimal brain development really is? Because I was raised in the normal American schooling system, and it might be that my brain is ossified into this thing where I'm not even capable of thinking some of the creative ways as to why the system might want to be different, why producing people off the same conveyor belt as produced me is even a desirable thing.
This is a deep philosophical question. This is where we land when we do the philosophy of education in particular. The deepest question in the philosophy of education is, what is the good human or the good community? Education raises for us the most foundational question, as does raising a child outside of schooling. Who are we to shape this child, and who are we to not shape this child? Which is to say that the absence of teacherly authority, the absence of parental authority is also potentially damaging.
You can't exactly abdicate that role.
Exactly. So, and this was the problem with the free school movement. This is what John Dewey was always criticizing, was the free school movement, where if the kid didn't want to learn math, he didn't have to. Well, that's actually a huge disservice to that kid. And so it's about this dance between autonomy and community, and about finding a way to exercise teacherly authority appropriately. And we are now in our culture in a crisis of teacherly authority, which is to say that who knows what or who to believe? Is it CNN or Fox News? Is it the New York Times, or, right, is it this college professor or this blogger who never went to college?
And it's really tough for people now to predict what the psychological and educational needs of a kid popping out of the school system 20 years from now is even going to be. Predicting the world 5 years in advance is a tough road to hoe these days.
Precisely. So again, back to Dewey, he of course addressed this question you asked explicitly. His most coherent answer went something like this: those forms of learning are best that enable more learning. So it's a call for forms of education that are open-ended and that allow for ongoing, lifelong learning. And so instead of, for example, teaching science as a collection of facts in a textbook, you teach the scientific method. It's an open form versus closed form way of defining the goals of education. And so the open form that Dewey's preferring is to say that freedom that's allowed to the child, that's best. The freedom that we allow them is the freedom that would allow them more freedom in the future. Right? So if you don't teach the child mathematics, you've closed off this huge realm of possibility for them. And so there are certain key things that need to be in place to allow for freedom, which is to say we need to limit freedom to allow for freedom. And that's the dance of teacherly authority, which is to say, no, you don't know what's good for you yet, but I'm going to allow you to grow into your autonomy. And as soon as possible, hand the reins back over to you for your own development, equipped as you are to develop further. And this is one of the hardest moves to make as a culture and as a school system, where we'd like to give standards and guidelines and multiple choice tests that say the outcomes of schooling are XYZ list of things, list of skills, when in fact the outcome of schooling needs to be a much more open set of potentials. We need to teach you how to to educate yourself to solve problems that we can't even predict are going to emerge yet. And so this is one of the turns we're making in schooling as a whole, is away from the kind of naive sense that it's just this pipeline into this predictable job market, and into this different sense that actually we live in a different kind of society, in an evolving world in which the unpredictable is what we can predict. And so there needs to be this radical kind of freeing up of what we value educationally, because we don't know, as you already said, what these kids are going to have to deal with 50 years from now, 30 years from now, 10 years from now.
Putting myself in the role of a high school guidance counselor or something like that, I would just have a hard time pretending like I could really give a kid reasonable advice on what the job market might be like in 15 years. Are certain job roles which are part and parcel of modern society even going to exist, or will they have been completely automated?
And this is the issue, is that the macroeconomic concerns, such as artificial intelligence-induced mass unemployment, and actually one of the hardest nuts to crack when it comes to artificial intelligence, and what I would think would be the natural outcome would be a basic income guarantee. The issue here is, what's the human then? If the human's not a wage laborer, what's the human if they don't get up every day and go to work at 9? How do we give meaning to our lives? This is the kind of question the educational system's going to have to start to answer. And it means a different kind of brain needs to come out the other side of it.
Right.
We're seeing that we don't have that kind of brain yet. The school system's failing to provide society with the skills and capacity it needs.
What are some of the ways in which developing kids psychologically could or should be improved in the current schooling system?
I mean, again, a deep issue. Sometimes it's called the hidden curriculum, but it's all the things that the school does almost unintentionally, almost by virtue of just being a school. The playground and gym class, the difference between the smart kid and the less smart kid, and how do they relate to one another. So there's essential social skills that play out. And so often when I am critical of schooling, I sometimes will give a vision of a society in which there are no schools. Ivan Illich wrote this great book, Deschooling Society. And people get nervous because they imagine it's all homeschooling, when in fact, the deschooled society is a return to almost the one-room schoolhouse model. Schools are also one of the only institutions that segregate by age. It's weird if you think about it. There's no other place in the world, except maybe an old folks' home, where people are organized simply by chronological age. And chronological age is a terrible proxy of development.
Yeah, it really is. You could do it by height. It would be just as arbitrary.
Yeah, exactly. And so one thing that I'd love to see disrupted is this. And the one-room schoolhouse, one of the virtues of it was that you had all ages mixing together. And so oftentimes the older kids would teach the younger kids. And there's no better way to learn something than to teach it.
Yeah.
And so there's that dynamic, which we're seeing in some rare contexts of charter schools. So that's an example of the kind of social insanity of school, which is the age-normed segregation. And then, of course, the actual segregation by race and socioeconomic class. So if you take a critical theorist view of education, there's always been what they call the correspondence principle, which is to say that the relations of schooling mirror the relations of the labor market. So that when we had the agrarian society, we had the one-room schoolhouse. When we had the factory society, we had the factory school. Now we're moving into this postmodern thing, and we've got these kind of startup charter schools. So the idea that you are habituated into the forms of labor and authority structures that you're going to be participating in schools, and this is divided socioeconomically so that you find in schools in lower working class neighborhoods, these schools are run very authoritarian. Whereas if you go to a suburban school, the kids are allowed to leave campus and do all kinds of things on their own will.
Casual Fridays and things like that.
Exactly. So what you're looking at is they're being prepared for professional life where you're given autonomy, and whereas the working class kids are being prepared for a different kind of worker supervisory relationship. So that's, again, there's the social insanity, and this has an effect on, of course, the brain. It's very clear that the kind of emotional environment that you spend time in becomes the pattern of your nervous system. With learning disabilities in particular, there's a great study. I think it was Todd Rose who did it, and he showed basically that it's not the disability itself that ultimately makes kids fail. It's all of the negative emotional connotations with schooling that follow from the disability. It's not the dyslexia that's the problem. It's the fact that I'm constantly barraged by special educators and negative feedback, and for ADHD, it's worse. So if 80% of the feedback you get at school is negative, then you come to have this emotional charge with schooling. You come to hate learning. And Michael Apple, this great critical theorist of education, he talked about the structure of feeling of schooling, right? The structure of the feeling of being in the classroom and what that does to the nature of your identity and your sense of self.
It seems like there's a lot of societal blowback, or at least hard feelings now, about just how coddling, and to some extent just being a kid in modern society is, how we try to insulate kids from any sort of negative feelings until they hit 18 years of age, and then all of a sudden the world can do whatever the world normally does to them. And that in some ways we might be really under-preparing kids for the fact that the real adult world is not always a nice place. What's the data have to say about those sorts of issues?
I mean, the data does show that there are shifting trends in self-perception, absolutely, towards what we would traditionally characterize as narcissism. But these trends they're generational, but they're also just cultural, period, which is to say that, yes, younger people are becoming more narcissistic, but so is everybody else. So I always find it interesting that parents who are addicted to their phones expect their kids not to be addicted to their phones. And parents who get up every day and go to a job they hate expect their kids to love school to pursue a job that they're eventually going to hate. So I think it's interesting, and I think because it's easy to point downward generationally.
We got a long history of doing that.
Yeah, and I think the first thing we need to do is look in the mirror that adults need to know about who they are and whether they're actually accomplishing what they think they're accomplishing before they start. Anyway, so I could go on and on about that, but it is true that the schools play a role in this. But if you look at the culture, and particularly social media, everything that social media is showing you has been on the back end programmed and delivered to you for your preference. And this comes down to the customization of advertisement across most of your web browsing. So the consistent message you're getting from the media is one that's flattering, is one that's giving you what you want to see, potentially even what you think you need. And so that's perhaps a deeper trend. There's a great book just called Mediated, and it's about this. It's about how we went from broadcast, the radio, everyone watches the same show, gets the same commercial, to this different form of media, which is now much more flattering, which is to say that we're creating these bubbles of perception, which make us delicate and make us able to be popped quite easily, because we actually think we're exposing ourselves to everything in the world by looking at Facebook, when in fact we're being exposed to a very narrow bandwidth of the world by looking at Facebook. And so that consistent self-confirmation bias that you get from these forms of media.
There's one counterpoint to that, which is that a lot of what we're given by social media feeds and things like that tends to be that which outrages us or makes us think that's the craziest thing in the world. I hate that with 6 exclamation points, because algorithmically, if we see something we hate, we're likely to take an action like forward it to a friend. Hey, don't you hate this also? And the algorithms pick up on that activity. So it's almost kind of like polarizes things into stuff that we're really, really going to love or really, really going to hate, and not much in the middle.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, I think we're going to look back 50, 60 years from now at what's going on with social media and screen time, the way we look at cigarettes. Like, we're literally going to look back and be like, Jesus. So yes, and the outraging stuff, as you're saying, is actually the stuff that's the clickbait. So the other thing to understand about Facebook is that it's an advertising mechanism, as is the vast majority of the internet. So again, the advertisement does, by its very virtue, is flattery. That's what advertisement does. We've gone into the social media thing here. The broader point is that, and again, to Dewey, the great philosopher of education, is that all the basic structures of our society are educational. And that means that all the basic structures of our society affect the nervous system in a very profound way. We can't think that the self-driving car, for example, that's coming isn't going to have a big impact on our nervous system. Think about just the buildup of neurotoxins from commuting. People talk about depression, anxiety. Well, what if you didn't have to commute an hour a day and sit in traffic? Instead, you could read or whatever in your self-driving car. So everything can be seen through the lens of how it affects the nervous system and how it affects education. It's one of the ways I'm trying to articulate in my next book the scope with which educators should conceive their task, which is to say that almost all forms of policy can be thought of in terms of kind of educational optimization or nervous system, so that we could live in a society that was literally designed across all the planes of our being for development. And this is kind of the concrete utopian vision that I lay out of a society of educational abundance.
How would you go about those big structural changes? What would you want to see done differently as far as what kids are taught, in what order, what level it's personalized at, even though you need to accommodate 10 or 20 or 30 million kids at any given time?
So yeah, again, I keep mentioning this next book. The title is called Education in the Anthropocene, Essays on the Future of Schools, Technology, and Society. And one of the questions I ask is this question, which is basically, how do we create a fundamentally new kind of educational system? And I start from the assumption that we need a path there. And I suggest essentially essentially repurposing existing schools. So literally gutting the school buildings and turning them into educational hubs, which are combinations of libraries, museums, co-working spaces, daycare centers, computer workshops. So what we have is in the school a new type of institution. And this institution looks like an amalgam of some of what we're seeing in, let's say, Silicon Valley startup incubators, and also some of the kind of fringiest parts of the charter school movement, and of course, Illich's vision of the deschooled society. Illich's vision of the deschooled society, each child got an educational credit card, which he could redeem with elders in the community. So what I'm doing here is with a vision of a network of educational hubs so that schools and other buildings in the local region become places where students go and essentially create by their own volition a kind of emergent path for their own education by making use of the decentralized resources of the community that are kind of brought together in the hub. So related to the hub vision is macroeconomic reforms, including things like a basic income guarantee and labor market reforms that would free parents to become kind of teacher, citizen scientists and populate the hub. And that whole thing can be arranged with a form of skill sharing network that's basically done online. So that's a taste of the vision. There's a bunch of different moving parts of it, but essentially replacing a one-size-fits-all school with a decentralized network of educational hubs. So one of the things that I'm building this education hub model to accommodate is radical social disruption. And that's important to keep in mind when you lay out these kind of utopian visions, which is to say you couldn't just plug and play this into our current job market and geopolitical situation. My argument is that educational abundance is our only hope. In fact, that the only way to get out of this and into a new way of being human beyond this global crisis, the only way to do that is by unleashing human potential like we never have before. And this goes all the way back to what we started about, which what do schools do to brains? We need to create open form schools that kind of catalyze uniqueness. And this is almost an evolutionary argument. Like ecosystems survive based on uniqueness. We need people to think of ideas and come up with things that no one would have ever thought of if they'd come out of a factory school where they learn exactly the same scientific facts, etc. So we need black swans to be everyday occurrent in terms of what people do with their minds. Otherwise, we're not going to solve these problems. The so-called grown-ups who are criticizing the younger generation, they're not solving these problems as far as I can tell. Things are not getting necessarily better on all fronts. In fact, on some fronts, they're getting drastically worse precisely because of the lack of openness and freedom in our educational system.
One of the things historically that we've always needed to do with humans is to some extent mass produce them. If one butcher, baker, candlestick maker was handy, in order to run a society, you needed a bazillion people that had that same skill set. But the one thing that we're really good at doing with technology now is once you can fit an algorithm to it, just replicate that, and you do not need to replicate humans in that same way anymore. It might be that where humans really come in handy is for their individual special uniqueness.
Exactly. It's a post-capitalist vision of a society after the wage labor system has been replaced by automated machines. Like that's one key thing that's happening in this world system pivot. And so as you describe, it means that the value of the human is no longer the value they can produce that's monetary. The value of the human is the value they can produce in all of these other realms of human expression and being, some of which are extremely serious. There's a whole bunch of sick old people who are cared for by strangers. There's a whole bunch of sick regular people who don't get the care they deserve. There are a whole bunch of children who never get to see their parents and go to alienating schools. So freeing people from the wage labor system allows them to be people. It doesn't allow them to be irresponsible drug addicts and artists and whatever. But the point being that we have these strange ideas about what the human is, and they've been given to us and enculturated into us. And we need to drop and shed many of those to survive. And so that means I think we do need to get a little bit radical with our visions of what schooling could be in the near future. These kinds of trends are already unfolding. I mean, the largest movement in education in the United States is the homeschool movement. That's largely dominated by the political right and kind of conservative religious, but I could imagine a very different ideology motivating people and drawing them away from the system. So I think times they are changing when it comes to education in particular, which means the brains are changing.
When I think about some of this, it reminds me of the X-Men, of everybody being a mutant with their own special mutant superpowers. But the downside, I guess, or maybe the thing that you don't think about when you think about the X-Men, but you do when you think about biology, is that most mutations are not beneficial. It's only the slimmest margin of random mutations of people just trying out something new that actually works out well. What I do feel like we might be losing, letting our educational system be so personalizable, is that most of the time it won't work out well for the person. Right now we have a system system which tries to do as best it can for everybody. It probably won't do the perfect job for anybody, but as you increase freedom, you increase people's ability to screw themselves up.
Absolutely. And this comes back to this issue of teacherly authority. So one of the details in the educational hub is the software that creates the individualized plan for the student. And baked into that software is curriculum design in terms of an integral theory of knowledge. And so there's all of this detail there about how we allow for the most appropriate forms of freedom in the moment without allowing for those forms of freedom that will eventually disallow future freedom. Right? So this is that idea of skeletal trajectory we want to set to keep them safe, especially at a young age, to enable as much autonomy as possible. And so this means that that software is developmentally diagnostic. And this comes to the nonprofit, which worked on this problem of how do you figure out where is a kid in their skill development and what's the next best step for them to take. Artificial intelligence tutoring system that makes those kind of judicious decisions about, well, kid, I know you want to do that, but let's wait a little bit. Do this first and then think about that. And that's the role of intergenerational transmission, is not just to school, not just to stand at the chalkboard and talk, but to create the environment where the kid can play and be safe. And just to flip your argument on it, turn it in another direction, one of the key things about learning, if you think of learning as an evolutionary process, is that mutations need to happen that fail in order for mutations to be found that work, which is to say you need to make mistakes to learn, and you need to make sometimes dangerous or painful mistakes to really learn. And we are mostly in an educational system that punishes you for mistakes and actually makes you fear making mistakes. Now, if you need to make mistakes to learn, we should have an educational system in which you are allowed to make mistakes and in fact put in a position where you can fail. So that's an important thing to remember here too, is that by not allowing children to fail, we actually don't allow them to learn. But in fact, enough freedom to fail safely, but not so much freedom that you can fail in a way where your life's destroyed now. And that's an important difference. And so hopefully the hub network and this kind of software platform that customizes the trajectory for the child, hopefully that has built in enough, but not too much in terms of educational guidance and teacherly authority.
What do we know as far as critical periods for brain development, or I think actually the term in your paper was sensitive periods rather than critical periods, but how might we change the way that we're doing things now to better take advantage of the sequence in which children might best learn things?
Yeah, that's another great example where the best of what we know about neuroscience, cognitive science, developmental psychology really contradicts what we do in educational practice. And so a couple of things here. One, the notion of the sensitive period I think is interesting, but can be kind of reified or made into something that it's not. So just for example, foreign language learning. It is true that in early infancy, the human ear can recognize all possible phonemes. But eventually that capacity, there's a process of pruning in the brain so that you become able to mostly only recognize the phonemes of your native language. And that makes perfect sense because now it just becomes this automated process. But by virtue of that, when you go and learn a foreign language as an adult, there's stuff you can't hear, not without a lot of practice, sometimes never. And so that's an example of a critical period that passes. But now that doesn't mean that you could not learn a foreign language as an adult. What it means is that you may never speak that language in such a way that you sound like you're a native speaker. But the main problem with foreign language learning with adults is how difficult it is as an adult to be doing kiddie language and to be making mistakes and talking like a child. So that's, again, the critical period is absolutely true, but it gets misunderstood. The work that I've done has been more about large-scale developmental reorganizations of capacity. And these are radically neglected in the school system. And this comes from the Piagetian tradition of thinking about human development in terms of a series of levels or phases, which are a sequence of prerequisites. So your use of the word sequence there is absolutely correct. And there's a big difference between what a 10-year-old can do and what a 20-year-old can do. And we have good ways of characterizing the kind of gradations of abstraction and complexity between. And so often what we see in the schools is a neglecting of the critical phase of when you can do abstract thought, and then the next critical phase of when you can do relations between systems of abstract thoughts. So there are these key milestones in the development of thought which could be used to build curriculum in a much more efficacious way. But instead, we expect kids who are not able to even think abstractly, and we give them all these abstract words. And if you really ask them deeply about what a word like ecosystem means, for example, they'll just say the forest out there. And that's great, and that's how they understood it, and that's the representational level. But the abstraction of ecosystem has to do with nonlinear dynamics, for example, which kids aren't going to get. And so this is an example example of, it's not quite the critical phases, but it's about the architecture of the mind and brain, which we neglect at our peril as educators. You just simply can't teach a kid something before he's ready. Now, doesn't mean that you dumb it all down. It means that you do diagnostics to figure out what's the right next step. So the sequencing and the delivery in terms of developmental diagnostics is a big kind of piece of that software I was describing at the core of the educational hub. Right? We need to know how to identify that kid who's precocious and already doing abstractions. And we know how to identify that kid who's doing abstractions in this one domain, but really struggles in this other one. So these ways of thinking about the kind of mass customization or the delivery of individualized educational trajectories, it's where everything is pointing in terms of what the neuroscience and cognitive science suggests, which is a science of uniqueness. To bring Dewey in the room again, Dewey said all the most important problems of philosophy come to a head in the problem of education.
Yeah.
Politics, ethics, religion, aesthetics, it's all in there. Nutrition. School lunches is a huge deal, and that always has been historically. So yeah, I think it's all tied up in education, and a lot of that has to do with the reflective ability of the human to shape its own brain. Now we're finally thinking about it in terms of the brain.
Do you think that given the fact that humans tend to think on such short-term time scales, like who's going to be the president for the next 4 years or things like that, making changes in education has massive consequences, but not over a terribly short time span? Is it going to be tough to get social buy-in given the long payoff before we get real consequences?
I think this is the time, actually. So we're looking in the next 5 years, maybe even longest 10, at something like the Wild West in the educational marketplace, precisely because it's becoming a marketplace. So I think one of the long trends in the politics of education since the 90s has been the move to privatize the schools, which is to say to take them away from being public and to turn them into being private. And that's happening. And I think we're going to see that accelerating. And what that means is that we're moving away from the massive school systems and the giant high schools into kind of a fractured, stratified marketplace of educational vendors. They'll call themselves schools. And some of them will be the most amazing schools that maybe have ever existed, but others shouldn't be called schools. Like we've got Burger King Academy already down in Florida. Burger King Academy attracts underperforming, usually African-American Hispanics from high schools who would otherwise drop out, trains them up with a GED to be a Burger King manager. And this is a charter school run by a private corporation that gets federal money to process these kids and turns a profit and gets managers for the Burger King. So that's an example of just the Wild West. That school exists. And then we have like the Montessori schools and the Waldorf schools in Silicon Valley. So it's just the world we're moving in educationally is one of increasingly stratified. What this also means is that there's opening. Go back into the 60s, 70s, 80s, try to change something in the schools. These massive public bureaucracies. Now we're going to have this more flexible, dynamic educational marketplace for better and for worse. And some of the better will be in pockets, incredible stuff happening. And the question is, will one of those pockets where something incredible happened find something that kind of goes viral and then spreads and it becomes the new center of gravity for tomorrow's educational system?
And it could be that there's going to be multiple high points. They might be mutually exclusive to some degree, like one educational philosophy versus another, but could both be better than what we have now.
Yeah, and that's what you hope for, is a polycentric emergence of these new alternatives. And this is what I'm saying. So I do think the time is kind of ripe, but it's not ripe for a massive just swapping out of one big system and swapping in of one new big system, but instead this evolutionary chaos period where there's going to be all these different things happening educationally. And then the question will be, what sticks?
Let's say that some 12-year-old has gotten a hold of this podcast and listens to you talk and says, hey, this guy sounds really smart. And it also sounds like he's saying that the current system is screwed up and I shouldn't necessarily pay much attention to what my school district bureaucracy tells me. What is a kid or a parent to do at this point before these changes sort of come online?
My answer to that question is usually separate learning from schooling in your own mind and in your own experience. Do not confuse learning with schooling and find a love of learning. Schools are going to be what they are. And I kind of used school to pursue power, which is to say I went to Harvard for a reason strategically. It was curiosity and I was driven to be a scholar, but it was also I wanted to see what was going on in these upper echelon educational places and to be empowered by the knowledge that I could get there. But that's not the route necessarily. If you learn to love learning, then you're going to be successful, period. And whether that success is through degrees and credentials and moving up this kind of hierarchy, or whether it's dropping out of high school, if you know how to learn and can pursue it and love it, I think the risk is that you're in a bad schooling situation and your parents can't move and you're kind of stuck in this crappy school. The risk is that you confuse schooling with learning and you confuse your failure in school with your failure as a human being or as an intellectual. when in fact failing at school could prove your success as a human being. I think that's important so that you can survive in a difficult schooling situation if you can find ways to pursue your love of learning outside of it. But that takes bravery, and it means being a little unconventional. And I think having also some faith in the next 10 years, the world's going to be totally different, so that many of your friends who are in school, all prepared and getting straight A's and with this career path in ninth grade or whatever, like, good luck to them. If the 12-year-old listening to this, I would say, don't necessarily listen to your teachers.
So you're saying my degree in typewriter repair is now useless?
Yes, that's what I'm saying. But your ability to learn computer repair, because you're a lifelong learner, is priceless. And that's the difference. We should not teach typewriter repair. We should teach the ability to become a repairman of any type, which is to say, how to learn to fix things, the principles of repair, and how to learn. I think that's what we need.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. Zak Stein for taking the time for that conversation. I like the occasional episode about something like education as opposed to the opiate crisis or an episode on phenylparacetam or Adderall or something that not everybody's necessarily going to be able to relate to. All of us have a horse in the race and some basis of knowledge when it comes to talking about the way that education works. But in some ways, the educational system can almost be a victim of its own familiarity. We think we know it so well. It seems like just a part of the unchanging environment like gravity, not something that you think you can really tinker with. But of course, that's not true. Of course, it is a system that could be radically revamped from what it is. But then we get into the really interesting questions of what is optimal. For those of you that want to dig deep on this, although the book is not out yet, it doesn't seem to be up on Amazon or anywhere else that I can find it. Zak Stein's upcoming book is called Education in the Anthropocene, Essays on the Future of Learning, Schooling, and Human Nature. But that's due out sooner than later. We'll let you know when that comes out. Put that as a late-breaking news item on the bookshelf page on smartdrugsmarts.com. The really tricky thing with even getting into these areas of social policy is that everyone's going to be second-guessing you. The safest thing to do is always to leave well enough alone, recognizing that a change could just as well change something for the worse than for the better, even if we know where the obvious holes in the current system are. We have the well-ingrained, well-established, and laudable idea that equality really needs to mean equality of opportunity. And one of the ways that, in theory at least, the equality of opportunity is enforced is by giving everyone essentially the same start in their educational system. In a perfect world, it would be great if every 18-year-old that pops out the end of the basic educational system was at the same starting block on the foot race of life. We know that's not the case now, but we have a system that at least is trying to aim for an ideal something like that. So the perplexing issue when you're talking about big educational overhauls is, do you try to get the whole big educational monolith to move in one way and say, this is better, so we're all going to lurch in this same direction together? Or do you say, we're going to let this school try this, that school try that, sort of a marketplace concept, and some schools will succeed, others will fail. You'll have much better chances to find the really successful needles in that haystack, but on the other hand, you'll also have the schools that don't perform so well, and what happens to the equality of opportunity for the kids that come out of those educational systems, since these are all multi-year experiments, multi-decade experiments, really, to run these tests. So none of us should exactly envy Dr. Stein or anybody else putting their name on the recommendations for the way that education should work in the future. It's a noble enterprise, but one where you're certainly courting a lot of controversy. But really interesting topic, lots to think about. Thank you so much again to Dr. Zak Stein. And let's move ahead now to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So it turns out that there is a lot of very good quotes about planning. Everything from the old Yiddish proverb, God laughs when man plans, to Mike Tyson's, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. But there's also a great one from President Eisenhower, who said, in preparing for battle, I've always found plans useless, but planning indispensable. And this idea was put to the test recently by a postdoc researcher at Stanford named Patricia Chen, who decided she wanted to see how students would perform based on more or less planning for their studies, literally thinking through the process of what university resources they would use to study, not necessarily devoting any more time to the study itself, but just giving some students an intervention that encourages them to do the planning of how their future studies might go, and then seeing how that would affect their grades. Appropriately enough, this was a statistics class, and she wanted to get statistics on this. So she divided the class into two groups. The groups were identical as far as the breakdown of the people. They had, on average, the same grades going in, the same demographics of the students that were in each group. So it was a total placebo-controlled experiment looking for a causal relationship. A week to 10 days before the test took place, half of the class would receive just a reminder that, hey, you've got a test coming up, and the other half of the class would receive a 15-minute survey asking them to think about the test that they were going to take. They were also asked to think about the grade that they were seeking to get, how important it was that they got that grade, and what they thought the follow-on effects in their life would be if they wind up with that grade. It also asked them to think about what kind of questions they thought that the exam might cover, which of the resources available them they would use to study, lecture notes or practice exam questions, checking with the instructor during office hours, peer discussions, which of the resources they would use and why they thought that that would be an effective study plan. Basically just forcing them to think through some sort of plan. Could be a good plan, could be a bad plan, said Chen. All too often, students just jump mindlessly into studying before they've even strategized what to use, without understanding why they're using each resource and without planning out how they would use the resource to learn effectively. I find this very unfortunate because it undermines their own potential to learn well and perform well. So when the academic dust had settled and the results were in, the students that received this intervention did an average of 1/3 of a letter grade better than the students that didn't. So a C+ going to a B- or an A going to an A+. And the results also seemed to be additive. Those who received the intervention prompts twice did better than those who received it only once. Furthermore, in addition to improving their grades, the students who received this intervention reported less stress related to the exam and a greater sense of control over their own performance. So even if Mike Tyson is planning on punching you in the mouth, it is probably still worth making that plan. How you might actually best go about accomplishing the things that you intend to do is almost always something that pays off in the long run. Even if you don't follow through on the plan, even if life goes in a different direction, which of us don't want to get 1/3 of a letter grade better in the class of life?
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, so you heard it. That was all for episode number 181. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you're curious about the links to anything that we talked about here, all of this will be up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/181. Last week, if you missed it, in episode number 180, I spoke with Dr. Ike Blom and Maria Steiner about the ongoing opiate crisis in America. And next week, in honor of the upcoming Memorial Day weekend, we're going to be talking a little about memory. Probably sneaking in a little overdose edition sometime in the next week or two also, so keep your eyes peeled for a little something extra in your RSS feed. But that is all for now. I will catch you back here next Friday, same time, same podcast, and with that same unwavering commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.